understand why things are the way they are, essentially to take the complex and overwhelming situation of Al-Quds and be able to unravel it and make it clear in order to both understand and work to solve the situation in Al-Quds. I just want to confirm working on the tech side. Okay. I'm just gonna hold for a second. What up? Okay, so it looks like I got the signal. Inshallah, we are ready to go again. So again, just to re-emphasize that point, right? So we are here in part 2 of kind of like the history of Al-Quds, right? And we're sitting here in 2021, and you might be asking, why exactly is it that we are, going over this, right? And like I said, right, and just to reiterate, because I think we had a little bit of a technical hitch, right? The reason we're learning history is in order to understand the reality before us and to really understand why things are the way they are. Essentially, to take the complex and overwhelming issue of Al-Quds and to be able to unravel it, to make it clear in order so that we can understand it, one, and so we can work to solve it. Now, just to kind of start this off, I think we need to recap a little bit from last time. So if you guys remember, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, we last kind of had our discussion. So previously, we went over the early history of Al-Quds, which consisted of much of the history of Bani Israel. Now, Bani Israel is the nation who were initially honored and preferred by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but then subsequently cursed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of their disobedience, cowardice, corruption, rebellion, and transgression. Now, one thing I guess I want to make a little bit different in this setting today is that we mostly had our question and answer session after the initial discussion, and inshallah we will have that too. But in the course of this kind of presentation, as we're going over some of my research and what we've sort of looked at, if you have any questions or concerns or something you want to add, feel free. Inshallah we can even learn from each other. To proceed. As before, one extremely important hadith that we need to keep in the back of our heads as we proceed on this journey is the following, as it deals, one, both with the history of Bani Israel and our own ummah and the right of authority. So it is narrated by Abu Hurairah that the Prophet ﷺ said, Bani Israel used to be ruled and guided by the prophets. Whenever a prophet died, another would take over his place. There will be no prophet after me, but there will be khulafa who will increase in number. The people asked, O Allah's Messenger ﷺ, what do you order us to do? He said, obey the one who will be given the Pledge of Allegiance first. Fulfill their rights, for Allah will ask them about any shortcomings in ruling those Allah has put under their guardianship. And this is quoted from Sahih Bukhari. And so the first half of this really has to do with Bani Israel, right? That there was prophets that came amongst them. And the second half, inshallah, we will start going through today. But before I wanted to jump into that, I wanted to kind of ask at least a couple of you guys that were here last time, that how many of you guys remember the date when Dawud alayhi salam is said to have conquered Jerusalem? Okay. The question was, so from some of the brothers that are here last time, how many of you guys can remember the date that was sort of ascribed to when Dawud alayhi salam conquered Jerusalem? Okay. How about when the Babylonians attacked Jerusalem, burnt the city to the ground, and took Bani Israelite slaves. Who remembers the date for that? Okay, maybe there's other ones that might be a little bit easier. How about when Bani Israel kind of worked under the Romans against, worked under the Persians against Romans, and they had briefly Al-Quds. Anybody remember that? Okay, so yeah, the brother was a little bit courageous. He said, no, I don't remember that. And I want to say, I kind of threw that out there because that's actually perfectly okay. If you remember that, I think that's kind of amazing. It might be a very, mashallah, benefit for the ummah. But if you didn't, you know what, that's okay as well. Because the purpose of going in this history is not to memorize the facts and dates exactly. That's great for, inshallah, when we're putting something together. And if you have that capability to do so, that's great as well. But the real point of going over this history and this overview is to be able to recognize the patterns that are playing around us, right? It is to be able to look at some of the things we hear and grow up hearing and be able to see, wait a second, that's not completely true because I have this understanding before. We kind of covered this more in the first lecture, but just to reiterate a little bit, right? I mean, how many of you guys have grown up and, you're having dinner or lunch and you've heard an elder, or maybe it's in the MSA or something like that, someone say, look at the Jews. Look at how amazing they are. Look at how they have conquered the world. Look at, for example, how they have what it appears to be the politicians and the economy and all these things in their hands. Who's heard that before? Okay, I think pretty much everyone, right? And I mean, likewise, there's many things we hear and questions we have, like why is Al-Quds important? What is going on? Why is there so much conflict? Why does everybody want a piece of it, right? We addressed some of these earlier, and inshallah, the point of this is to understand all of those whys, right? It's not about the facts and figures and dates. They have their place, but it's to understand the why so we can inshallah move forward as Muslims who think, who can understand their reality and who can address it. So if you guys remember a little bit from the previous session, right? What are some of those patterns that we kind of remembered? If you guys recall it, feel free to share. And inshallah, we can get into it, right? So we found going through the history and keeping the hadith of Muhammad ﷺ in mind that indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used to send prophets to Bani Israel. And they were indeed ruled by them, right? They were the leaders of Bani Israel, sent to rule and remind them of their covenant with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and hold their hands from committing corruption. We found that Bani Israel only really had victory and success when they had a prophet sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to rule over them. And when they submitted and obeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the prophet sent to them. Such as in the example of Dawud alayhi salam or Sulaiman alayhi salam, that was really, if you look at their, Jewish history from their sources, their golden era, where they're always kind of trying to come back to. They don't want to do any of the following, but they want obviously the glory. We also found that the promises of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His preference was based on obedience. And when they were disobedient, they were destroyed from their houses, from their homes, stripped of their authority, taken as captives and slaves repeatedly. It's kind of it was kind of shocking. Just kind of looking into that, we found that since they rejected Isa alayhi salam, and since all of them rejected Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that they are profitless. True. They have no more prophets. So that means essentially they are leaderless. Now I want to kind of ask you a question based on last time, right? Is what do you think happens when you don't have any real internal leadership? Yeah, like I said, this is open. Don't feel free to chaos.
There's
Anarchy. Corruption.
Power vacuum.
Okay, yeah, perfect. All of these things are absolutely true. There's a power vacuum that needs to be filled in order to exist, right? So what essentially happens is you become ruled from the outside, and you as a nation must orbit around another nation, around another superpower for your survival. You can no longer live and rule your own destiny. You must attach yourself to some sort of leader, some sort of force from the outside. And although we're not going into the history of Bani Israel too much in this instance, unless you guys want a quick review, we saw that this is exactly what happened to Bani Israel once they rejected their prophets, once they mocked them, once they killed them, once they rejected them, once they completely refused to believe in Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. They became basically really these underlings that were ping-ponged by the superpowers of the time. The Persians, the Babylonians kicked them out here. The Persians kind of picked them here. The Romans kicked them out over here, and then, that was essentially their history. I mean, just really quick, right? That's a myth we hear all the time, right? That Bani Israel and basically the Yahud, the Jews, are invincible. Now, when you just look at a cursory glance of history, you don't have to be a genius, right? It's like, absolutely not. I mean, it's quite the opposite. And we won't go into this fully, but if you're following the dots, you should be able to sort of better anticipate what is going to come, as we get closer to our timeline. One of the questions we left off on was, how is it that if we can recognize this pattern, right, that if Bani Israel, since they have no more prophets, and since there will be no more prophets, are leaderless, and they must attach themselves to other powers, and through our history, they were ping-ponged, how is it then now they seem so powerful? How is it now that the Muslims, like we were discussing before this discussion, how is it that they're being, destroying protests in Palestine? How is it that they're conquering these lands? How is it that the powers in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, are not able to even, scratch them, or so it appears, right? So some of these questions we're not going to hit today. It is something that's going to come up a little bit in later sessions. But if, again, the point of history is to understand the patterns, right? And if you can understand a little bit of the patterns, I think you should be able to, start connecting those dots. Now, last time, so we started with Bani Israel, right? And we took our discussion all the way up to the peaceful conquest of Al-Quds and Jerusalem by Umar radiallahu anhu, who was the second Khalifa of the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, inshallah, this is kind of where we're going to dive back in today. So today's session dives a little bit more onto the side of Islamic history in relation to Al-Quds. Again, right, I want you, as we're kind of here having this discussion, to keep that hadith in mind, right? And I'm just going to paraphrase it. It was like Bani Israel was ruled by the prophets, right? And then Rasulullah says, there will be no prophet after me, but there will be khulafa, numbering many. So in light of this, let's inshallah dive in. Now, a lot of the history starts off with Umar ibn al-Khattab, right, as the conquest of Al-Quds. But I want to quickly touch up a little bit before that, right, in the time of under Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Al-Quds obviously had significance before that time, right? Originally, the Qibla for the Muslims was Al-Quds. The site of the Isra wal Miraj was Al-Quds. The state of authority of Islam was established under the Prophet ﷺ, and the trajectory of the state was set, meaning really the conquest of the Arab Peninsula and directly challenging the superpowers of the time in order to make the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala supreme. Now, it is upon this trajectory that the leaders after him, the Khulafa, followed, right? So one of the superpowers was the Persians, and the other was the Byzantines, which were essentially the Christians, the Christianized Romans. Now, okay, under the Khulafa of Umar. So inshallah, we're going to quickly kind of dive into the history, and it's going to be a lot of stuff kind of quick. I did my best to try to keep it simple because we're looking for overviews. But if there is any questions you guys have, feel free to ask. And if there is any inshallah knowledge or extra comments you guys want to make, feel free to do so. So under the Khulafa Umar, right, after the defeat of the Byzantines in Yarmouk, the whole of Syria, including Palestine, fell into the Muslims' hands. The keys of Jerusalem were handed peacefully over to Amir al-Mu'mineen, Umar radiallahu anhu, and this was really the first peaceful takeover of Jerusalem. Umar himself cleaned the area where the Isra wal Miraj occurred, and he established also a masjid in the city of Jerusalem. Now it is 60 years after this point, at 72 after Hijri or 691 CE, under the Khilafah of Malik ibn Marwan, that the Dome of the Rock is built. 2 years after that, the Masjid al-Aqsa structure itself is built in Al-Quds. And during the Umayyad period, right, during the Umayyad Khulafa, they had, since they were central server in Damascus, they had a lot of contributions to Jerusalem and Al-Quds. They were the ones that erected a lot of the architecture that, the city might be famous for. And just to kind of add on to that about a little bit of the significance, Muawiyah, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, Sulaiman ibn Abdul Malik, and more actually received their bayahs in Jerusalem. Just to kind of show you the significance of the land, even through our history. Now, as we proceed, we're kind of moving into the Abbasid period now, right? Under the Abbasid Khulafa. Now, during the Abbasid period, the capital of the Islamic State, of the Khilafah, moves from Damascus to Baghdad, right, in Egypt. So it's a shift in power in terms of our history. However, even still, the Khulafa paid special tribute to Al-Quds and continued to fund and sustain it. Now, preceding this period a little bit, right, there was obviously history is not perfect, nor is Islamic history, nor do any of us ever assume it is or take it as a source of that. So during this time also, Palestine was shortly under the Fatimids, which was a competing rulership, right? And it's outside of the Sunni Islam. So under the Fatimids from Egypt in the 11th century, and they controlled. And then after the Fatimids, it was controlled by the Seljuk Turks between 1071 and 1098 CE. Preceding this, we kind of get into the major turmoil of Al-Quds, right? In terms of our Islamic history. And that is the Crusades. So in 1096, the Crusades are launched by the Pope of the Christians and of Western Europe for the recovery of the Holy Land. And specifically, their inspiration a lot was for the recovery of the Holy Sepulchre in particular. And this is a site in Christian kind of history or theology where they assume that Isa alayhi salam was killed or taken up. So this is kind of their kind of focal point for it. In 1099 CE, so that's about 3 years after the start of the Crusades, the Christians laid siege to Jerusalem, and after 40 days, the city fell. The Crusaders indiscriminately massacred the men, the women, the children. They didn't care if there were Muslims, Jews, or even the Christians that were living in those Islamic lands. They converted the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa into churches. And their grip on the Holy Land lasted 86 years. To put that into a little bit of perspective, anyone have any guess of how long Israel has been in existence?
70 years.
Your first guess was actually very close. So 72 years as of today, as of this year. So inshallah, we see good times ahead, sooner than that. May Allah make things easy, right? So what's going on during this time period, right? So as the Crusaders are upon Jerusalem and the Holy Land, how did they get their foothold in there? As we shift our focus to the periphery of Jerusalem, we see that the Muslims are now a little bit divided. And this is essentially what allowed the Crusaders to come in. Now, efforts have been made for that 86-year span, for that time being, to unify the Muslims in the area. First by many Muslims before that time, and then finally by a young commander that I think many of you would know. And here we are referring to Salahuddin Ayyubi. Now, a whole series could be done about him and the conquest of Jerusalem. Whole books can be written as they are, and much more is needed in this area. But for the purpose of our lecture, we're just going to kind of go over this briefly. So the land is being united by Salahuddin Ayyubi, right? He's dealing with the Muslims first. In July 1787 CE, Salahuddin defeats the Crusaders in the Battle of Hittin. Right after this battle, a peace is brokered between the Crusaders and the Muslims under Salahuddin. What happens next? The Crusaders break their end of the deal. And this provides the commander of the Muslims at that time in the area, Salahuddin, the perfect opportunity to take Jerusalem. So it was broken actually by one of the lowlifes of history, Reynaud of Chetlion, which allowed Salahuddin to retaliate. 3 months after Hittin, Salahuddin and the Muslims succeeded in capturing Jerusalem. Now, in contrast to the Crusaders, upon the conquest of Jerusalem, no bloodshed or massacres occurred. Civilians were given protection, property was held sacred, and people were allowed to worship. But what did Salahuddin do first, right? In context of what we're talking about today, the first priority of the conquest was to claim and restore Al-Quds and purify the corruption of the Crusaders, meaning the Dome of the Rock and Masjid al-Aqsa and that vicinity. They purified it of their crosses and their corruption. Jerusalem was now under the Ayyubids, back in Muslim control. Now, there is a small stretch of history between around 1243 CE or 641 AH, where there was a couple of, some corrupt Muslim rulers who did hand over Jerusalem minus Al-Quds. So again, even in our weaker times, Al-Quds keeps a very high place in Muslim history. So it was handed over to the Europeans for a span of 10 years. A small glimpse of it, and then back. So now we're transitioning a little bit further. Now, I know that was a lot of detail kind of quickly. I want to take a pause right there. Any questions or concerns? Okay, so let's move on. So that was under the time of Salahuddin. So we're now moving forward a little bit in 1260 CE, in the era of the Mongols. In 1258, let's take a step back 2 years. In 1258 CE, the Mongols destroyed Baghdad. Now, I don't know how familiar you guys are with that history, but the Mongols sacked Baghdad. They took the Khalifa of the Muslims, and they took him outside the city, as well as some leaders, and they executed the Khalifa themselves, pretty brutally outside the city of Baghdad. And for these, that was maybe the first time in Islamic history that there was no Khalifa amongst Muslims. Anyone know how long that lasted, that absence of a Khalifa? 3 years. This guy here knows his history. It lasted 3 years, right? And there's actually a really good book about this. It's called Longing for the Lost Caliphate. If you guys are kind of interested about this, maybe a separate discussion. But it is interesting to note that the Muslim scholars of the time, the people, they were going wild. I mean, how can anything occur, in terms of the institution of the state, without that position in place? So within 3 years, that was rectified. So anyways, that's 1258 CE. The Mongols sacked Baghdad. 2 years after that, in 1260 CE, the Mongols captured Jerusalem. In the same year, the Mongols are defeated by the Mamluks, led by Qutuz and Baybars. Specifically in the Battle of Anjalut, which was a decisive turn of the tides amongst the fight against the Mongols. The Mamluks ruled Palestine, Jerusalem, and Al-Quds until 922 AH or 1516 CE. This was when, again, the peaceful transfer of power was occurred to the Uthmani Khilafah. So from the Mamluks to the Ottoman Caliphate or the Uthmani Khilafah. In 1516 CE, Palestine was handed over to the Uthmanis under Selim I. Selim prostrated and exclaimed, "Thanks to Allah, I am now the possessor of the sanctuary of the first Qibla." Again, we're getting closer and closer to our time, but the importance of Al-Quds stays, in the hearts of the Muslims, in the hearts of the Khulafa. This is something that one of the questions we posed in the beginning: why do we even care about Al-Quds, right? Because a lot of Muslims nowadays, if you hear on social media and stuff like that, they're kind of asserting, why not just leave? What is it worth anyways? Why are we being massacred, as we are? So there's these discussions taking place. Now, under the Uthmani Khilafah, right, people of all faiths enjoyed freedom under the Muslims. And in particular, it's kind of funny, the Jews found shelter as they were being persecuted in other areas like Europe. They found shelter under the Uthmani Khilafah. Under the Khilafah of Sulaiman al-Qanuni, all of Jerusalem, including its buildings, walls, gates, towers, etc., were renewed, rejuvenated, built up. They got the best of the best artisans they could find, tile makers, and had them install 40,000 tiles in the Dome of the Rock under with the inscription of Surah Yasin to celebrate, again, the Isra wal Miraj. Palestine, as we know it, under the Uthmani Khilafah, existed for more than 400 years. With the demise of the Uthmani Khilafah after World War I, the Muslim world, as we know it, was divided, and Jerusalem became under attack. Now, I kind of want to pause the discussion of history there for now, for this session, because I know there's a lot that we kind of covered. And inshallah, we're going to be going over in a lot more detail what happened after World War I. Now, I want to kind of take a step back, right? A lot of data to kind of take in, right? And as we have quickly traversed through Islamic history, we have to understand a few things. Namely that, as Muslims, history is not our source of thinking, nor is it really our inspiration. Rather, that is revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the example of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we're looking at history in order to just see where we're at, because if you don't know who you are, where you came from, where you're standing, you cannot, move forward. So just to make that distinction clear. And we have to ask ourselves, why was Al-Quds so important to the Ummah? And why did the Ummah sacrifice so much for Al-Quds? The answer again comes back to revelation, right? The history follows the revelation and not the other way around. So Al-Quds is dear and sacred to us as Muslims because it was the first Qibla of Islam, which was only changed 16 months after the Hijrah. So that means for 14 out of the 23 years of the prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Al-Quds was the Qibla of the Muslims. It is dear to us because it is the site to which Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam journeyed to during the Isra wal Miraj, where he sallallahu alaihi wasallam was ascended to Al-Quds, to Jannah from there, where the salah was enjoined upon this ummah, and where the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ led the prophets in prayer and cemented his role as the seal of the prophets. This is where it occurred. It is dear to us because of all of the noble prophets Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent, and that this land holds within it. For all the mountains and hills that the prophets walked upon. It is dear to us because it was won over by the blood of the Sahaba, and which is home to many of their graves. It is the seat of many of the Khulafa and a land in Darul Islam. Most importantly, it is dear and beloved to us because it is beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, going back to the hadith we started with, right? Again, just to reiterate, the Prophet ﷺ said, Bani Israel used to be ruled and guided by the prophets. Whenever a prophet died, another would take over his place. There will be no prophets after me, but there will be khulafa who will number and increase in many. The people asked, O Allah's Messenger, ﷺ, what do you order us to do? He said, obey the one who will be given the Pledge of Allegiance first, fulfill their rights, and for Allah will ask them about their shortcomings in ruling those Allah has put under their guardianship. History testifies to the words of Muhammad ﷺ, as after his death, indeed many khulafa preceded him, as the rulers and shepherds of the Muslim Ummah, who conquered Al-Quds, protected it, rescued it, built it, and made the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the law of the land. And finally, until the institution of the Khilafah was disbanded after World War I. Now, I want to save some of those details as we move forward, but there are a couple of questions I want to ask, just kind of open the floor for the audience, right? Why do you think that we learn about Bani Israel? And why do you think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions them so much in the Quran?
Learn from their mistakes.
Right. I mean, not only is he good with dates, he's good with tafsir as well. MashaAllah. Yeah, so we're not here just because we like to, bash people or whatever. We're here because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set them as an example for us, for an ummah that failed. Okay. So what? To follow up with that, so what happens to a people that claim to believe in Allah but are not ruled by the prophets, or what they left? They're ping pong. They're humiliated. They're underlings. They're forced. They have no control over their destiny. They're fragmented. They're doomed. Okay. What happens to the Ummah of Muhammad ﷺ without a Khalifa? Yeah, I think a lot of those answers are the same, but we're not going to jump into that right now. Inshallah, as we proceed, we're going to dive into exactly what that means, right? So all of this is not just for fun. Looking at Bani Israel as, a lot of times is a mirror looking into ourselves. What we do not want to be, what we do not want to emulate, what do we not want to follow. It reminds me of a book. I just want to kind of maybe share this thought. I wasn't sure where to put it, right? So I don't know if you guys are aware, but there's this book called The Muslims Are Coming. It's essentially a book about Islamophobia, right? And it goes through the topic pretty well. It shares like the stats, it shares like the political cases, it shares the history in Europe, France, the US, etc. But there's one thing, to be honest with you, that I could not get out of my mind after reading that book, and it was the title of the last chapter. And it was titled "Dream Not of Other Worlds." Just to repeat that, the title was "Dream Not of Other Worlds," right? And a lot of times we talk about Islamophobia, right? The hatred of Islam, and we talk about, so and so country hates Islam or so and so people hate Islam, but you find sometimes, unfortunately, like even amongst ourselves, right? As Muslims, sometimes we're told internally, dream not of other worlds. You're daydreaming. You're looking into history. This is what it is. Just move forward. Don't even think about it. Don't even dream about it. And this is kind of the purpose of this series a little bit, right? Is to understand the history, so we are allowed to dream of another world. So we are allowed to think about something different. So we are allowed to move beyond the confines of the reality which we find ourselves in, and take the revelation and make the reality match it. So we are allowed to dream of other worlds. So inshallah, we will be proceeding with that next time going forward. So at this point, we're going to have like a much more open discussion with the brothers here. For anyone following online, you're welcome to join us. And usually after the talk, we go over a couple more details and things that we can't cover here. In any case, Jazakallah khair for joining us, and inshallah the live stream will be over shortly, and we'll proceed to our